to literally sacrifice children on the altar of your ideology, I think is kind of unforgivable, but it does show how far some decent people can go when they are ideologically brainwashed. I think it means that good people end up doing, well, purely evil things, frankly.
In this episode, I'm sitting down with writer and comedian Andrew Doyle. His latest book is titled The End of Woke: How the Culture War Went Too Far and What to Expect from the Counter-Revolution.
Sweden had the highest level of trust in Europe for a long time. And then, since the migrant crisis, there are grenades going off in the streets and there are gunfights.
Where is Western civilization headed? Will DEI initiatives and gender ideology be replaced by something else?
I mean, if you look at all the various definitions of hate speech across the European statute books, none of them agree. No one knows what it is. We have a police force that is trained by a quango called the College of Policing, and they've trained the police in our country to believe that it's their role to monitor speech and thought and to arrest people for offensive speech.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick.
You know, I was incredibly disappointed. I had scheduled this interview with Titania McGrath, and you came instead.
She's not available. She's busy. She's always busy. She's a workhorse. It's not me, no. She was just a character I created to mock, as you know, mock the woke movement. But you'd be surprised how many people accuse me of impersonating a woman online, which suggests to me they don't understand the concept of an author creating a fictional character. It's quite a flaw, that.
There's something about how people will intentionally misunderstand certain people.
Yeah.
Understand in highly inappropriate ways other types of people. And this is central to what you're writing about, actually.
Yeah. Yes, that is true. The willful misunderstanding. Well, willful, or I always like to assume that people mean what they say. And so if someone mischaracterizes me so wildly, I mean, I'm sure you've had it as well, but the sort of wild mischaracterization, the ascribing of views to someone, I've seen it about myself. I mean, I've read paragraphs about myself and I think I don't recognize who they're talking about. I mean, one of the things I say in my book is that the culture war is really a case of imaginary hate. It's people imagining fascists in the shadows. It's people imagining this world of venom and bile and vitriol and hatred. And there's some of that, but that's not the world. The world is not that simple, you know?
You know, you make a case, of course, that we may indeed be approaching the end of woke, or at least having hit the inflection point.
Yeah.
But I'm actually quite concerned about the fact that our technologies exist today that are used constantly, as far as I can tell, volitionally or not volitionally, that kind of would prevent the end of polarizing information being pushed into an ecosystem constantly.
But that's always been the case. But as you say, I suppose the technology amplifies it now. So, I mean, one thing I know I've called the book The End of Woke, but you know, having looked at it, that I don't mean it's over, let's have a party and go home. I mean, the case I'm making very clearly is that woke is the latest manifestation of the authoritarian impulse that recurs throughout human history. And so therefore, wokeness was just the latest version of it, but there's going to be some other version. The concept of authoritarianism can't go away because it's so deeply embedded in the human condition. So the title, I suppose, might be ill-advised. Maybe there should have been a question mark. But I'm really saying that this stage of authoritarianism, this wokeness, too many things have changed now for it to retain the stranglehold that it once had on society. That's sort of gone. But yeah, sure, absolutely. Other things will happen. Other movements will take its place, and other examples of disinformation and misinformation and people just getting it wrong and not thinking beyond these very narrow parameters, that will happen as well. It probably, well, it certainly has been accelerated by social media and the digital age. I mean, that's happened. That's why wokeness became a thing. You know, that's a movement which has never enjoyed the support of the population at large. So much of the woke movement has been about very, very privileged people, very paternalistically saying they know best for the masses, for the plebeians, you know. I very much see the woke as Coriolanus incarnate. I would say what you say about one thing that does concern me, I mean, yes, the social media aspect, that's not going anywhere. And I've fallen for it. You know, sometimes when I see something online, I've got into the habit of double checking and triple checking every single story. Same. And I have made mistakes where I've said to people, oh, did you hear about that? and then I found out the whole damn thing was a concoction, wasn't real. That's bound to happen. It does force us to be more sedulous, I suppose. It forces us to be more diligent and vigilant, and as we consume information, or as we read this stuff. That's a worry. AI similarly worries me in that respect, insofar as it provides too many shortcuts for thought, and the temptation will be, oh, ChatGPT, just tell me what's the best way to do this, what's the best way to phrase this, what should I think about this even. And those shortcuts are deadly. I think I think you need to train the brain like a muscle. Not that I train any other muscle, I'm very lazy, but I would say the brain I do try to train. At least I've got that, even if I'm this sort of flabby mess. At least I'm thinking, and thinking to me matters more than anything else.
I keep thinking about all of this in the context of media. And you point out, I was reading your chapter that's specifically on the authoritarian impulse.
Yeah.
And you talk about how the fact that we, despite everything that's happened, we do have a free press. But, I would argue many of the big media, what I would call the legacy media, have kind of transitioned into a different kind of journalism, what they themselves would call activist journalism, which is, you assume the correct view ahead of time and you contort the facts and the picture of the facts into what that is. If that's indeed the case, and so many of our media do function this way, I don't know if we really have a free press anymore. I mean,
we do. Well, that's where the social media and online can provide a benefit. You can get a corrective to that. You're absolutely right. The legacy media is so ideologically captured one way or the other that it does the opposite of this. How the scientific method is to try and disprove your own thesis and then reach a conclusion. And the legacy media doesn't do that. You're absolutely right. By and large, that sounds like a terrible generalization, because there are good journalists still.
No, and 100% there are. 100% there are.
But if you take an institution like the BBC, there are excellent journalists at the BBC. There are journalists who've been tearing their hair out over what's been going on. But for a number of years now, there has been an LGBT desk at the BBC. All stories relating to sexuality or gender or orientation or anything like that had to go past this desk first for approval. They effectively had the power of veto over stories if the stories, for example, the WPATH files, which were leaked by Michael Schellenberger and Mia Hughes, which are one of the biggest medical scandals of my lifetime. WPATH is the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. It is the leading international body on what they call gender-affirming care. It is the body of self-proclaimed experts and professionals who advises across the globe medical institutions, including the National Health Service in the UK, and so has incredible disproportionate influence. And they are very supportive of this notion of gender-affirming care. In other words, a vulnerable person, a child, can come and say, I believe I am this, I'm born in the wrong body, and that the initial response must be to affirm that, even to medicalize that, so that this individual's perception of themselves aligns more closely with their body. Now, that in itself is a controversial, unscientific position to take. But what makes matters worse is the leaked memos from WPATH, which were released in the WPATH files, prove that senior individuals at WPATH and people that were working with them were fully aware that a lot of these vulnerable people could not possibly give informed consent to the treatment that they were receiving. That's very, very dangerous and dodgy. I mean, you have these doctors talking about how, these kids don't even have biology at high school. They won't understand it. They can't possibly understand the concept of being, of losing the capacity for sexual pleasure in later life, or infertility in later life. How can a prepubescent even understand what any of that means? So they knew all of this. Those leaked files should have been front page of all the papers for weeks. It's that big a deal. BBC hasn't mentioned it once. I contacted the BBC over 5 times, it must be 5 or 6 times, to their press office, asking why they are omitting the biggest medical scandal of our lifetimes. And they first ignored my requests, even though I was working for a news network at the time in the UK called GB News. Then when they finally did get back to me, and I think they only got back to me because I managed to find a way to contact someone high up in the press office, and I was saying, this isn't good enough. Like you're the state broadcaster, you have a responsibility to answer these questions. And I eventually got a one-line response, which was news editors make decisions about the stories of the day, you know, depending on various factors. In other words, go away, we don't want to answer your question. And I gave them some time, even when the White House, there was a big story about the White House because they discovered that Rachel Levine had effectively put pressure onto WPATH to ensure that there was no lower limit to the age of transition, which is a big story. Even the White House talked about this. Even after that, even after the Cass review, the BBC just didn't mention it, as though it never happened. I contacted them again. I got the same line back, as though a robot, an automaton, just written the same message back to me. So there's an example of not just a network, but the state broadcaster omitting a major story for partisan ideological reasons. And I don't know why, but one assumes it's because the LGBT desk said, no, we can't report on this. And every reporter, no matter how good they are, had to defer to the power of veto. And that shows you how ideological capture works. It isn't that everyone working for an organization suddenly is in lockstep over these issues. What it is that a certain contingent who are sufficiently powerful or sufficiently empowered by those in charge, which is what's happened, which is why Tim Davie, the Director General, has resigned. It's why the head of news has resigned, ostensibly because of this false editing of a Trump speech. But really, there's a lot more going on here. There is a deep ideological rot at the heart of it.
Andrew, we're going to take a quick break, and
Yes.
folks, we're going to be right back. And we're back with Andrew Doyle, author of The End of Woke. You know, you could argue that this recent election in the United States was a kind of a repudiation of woke and censorship and all sorts of these kind of related things, but that hasn't necessarily been replicated in other places like your home country and.
Well, no, but we have a very authoritarian government in the form of the Labour government. But then the vast majority of the woke movement was presided over by a right-wing conservative government. So wokeness infected both sides of the aisle. You know, it's different with Trump. It's different with the MAGA movement because there is an explicitly anti-woke tinge to that. But yeah, you're right. It hasn't been replicated in the UK because in the UK, really the Labour government got in on the back of fatigue, sort of mass fatigue. People were fed up with the Conservatives. They'd been in charge for so long. They'd failed and reneged on most of their promises. You know, they promised to deal with the migration issue. It escalated massively under Boris Johnson. So they'd failed hugely. Then there was the Partygate, COVID, various controversies. And what actually happened is Keir Starmer was elected in with a massive majority. And you look at that on paper and you think, wow, there's suddenly mass support for Keir Starmer. It was such a low turnout for him. He won fewer votes than Jeremy Corbyn did when Jeremy Corbyn lost in 2019. So it's not like he has an incredible mandate. I think it's something roughly around 27% of the electorate or something. It's very low. He hasn't got an overwhelming mandate, but he has got a massive stonking majority in Parliament, which is why he's able to introduce, he took the online safety bill, which was a conservative idea, and just ran with it. So now we have this ridiculous situation where the internet is supposedly regulated by Ofcom, which is a regulatory body in the UK, who have been writing threatening letters to Rumble and American companies saying you're going to have to censor, otherwise we're going to fine you. That's how hubristic Ofcom is and how hubristic the British government is. They still think they have an empire of cyberspace, right? It's insane, actually.
Are you not worried about talking about things this way, given that I guess you're here, but I understand people are constantly being arrested for speech violations.
Well, in the UK, the Times Freedom of Information request, the Times of London, which is a big newspaper, found that 12,000 a year are being arrested in the UK for offensive things they write online. Now, some of those are going to be connected to other crimes like domestic abuse, but it's still going to be in the thousands. This is still a very serious situation. 30 a day being arrested for speech crime. The Online Safety Act has made that even worse. Well, we have a police force that is trained by a quango called the College of Policing unelected quango. It's got no authority, no accountability. You can't vote them out. And they've trained the police in our country to believe that it's their role to monitor speech and thought and to arrest people for offensive speech. So that's so deeply embedded. The only way you're going to deal with that is to abolish the College of Policing, which no politician seems to have the guts to do. But of course it should go. It's not fit for purpose. It's an activist body. And everything trickles down from that. We don't have the First Amendment. We don't have a codified constitution. We don't have these protections in place. What we have is hate speech laws encoded in the various acts. We've got, it would be the Public Order Act 1986 and the Communications Act 2003, and the Malicious Communications Act as well. We've never had a government in recent years willing to tackle this problem. You know, I wrote that book, Free Speech and Why It Matters. The arguments in that book.
And you, by the way, you wrote it at a time when it was a lot, I would think it was a lot more controversial than right now, right?
So yes, I mean,
yeah.
When did that was 2020.
Yeah, I don't remember when it was, but I remember thinking this guy has some guts to publish this, right?
Which was weird because it shouldn't be controversial, but that was the reason I wanted to write the book. And partly because I wanted to restate the case for free speech. So the arguments aren't original to me. You know, these are arguments that have been reiterated by much smarter people than me throughout history. But I wanted to reiterate them in a short, succinct, accessible way because I think we have an obligation to do so. I think every successive generation has to make the case for free speech because it's not something that's won and then it is in our grasp evermore. It's always at risk. Every day, you know, you read an article about people trying to eliminate free speech or draw their own exceptions or carve out exceptions. That's why the First Amendment, even though it's a great protection, it's not invulnerable to attack or modification or misinterpretation. You know, all of that can still happen. That's what a lot of campaigners and activists want. But you look at the danger of that. I mean, they want hate speech to be, you know, exceptions to be carved out for hate speech. No one can define hate speech. No one knows what it means. And human beings hate. That's an emotion that has developed in us over many, many years. You can't wish away a human emotion with the stroke of a pen. You may as well try and legislate against envy. It doesn't make sense. So, you know, and when you try, I mean, if you look at all the various definitions of hate speech across European statute books, none of them agree. No one knows what it is.
Real only way with this is to cultivate strong moral code.
Quite, which is part of this social contract that I've been talking about in the book. Is, you know, you have to develop. You know, what you're aiming for is a high trust society. A high trust society only comes about through generations of that negotiation of that social contract. That's the only way that it can exist. And look how quickly it can dissolve.
Can come apart. Well, and that's one of the, you know, kind of criticisms too, I think, of liberalism. I mean, I'm just, you know, just today, actually, I was thinking about Japan. There were a few people posting on X about Japan and just, you know, how remarkable. And one of the things I noticed, my wife worked there for years. She speaks some Japanese enough to kind of get by, and took me for the first time. I've always been infatuated with the country and the culture, but this was, you know, it's just wonderful to be taken there. But it's an unbelievably safe country.
And so was Sweden. I mean, Sweden had the highest level of trust in Europe for a long time. And then since the migrant crisis, where they had this reckless migration policy, 20% of all Swedish citizens are now not born in Sweden. That's an unsustainable number. And there are grenades going off in the streets, and there are gunfights, and, you know, I had a friend of mine, a Swedish comedian, texting me 6 years ago saying, there's bombs going off in my road. This is happening all the time. And no one in the media is talking about it. I mean, Sweden's a very good cautionary tale for everyone else. If you had a liberal system, you would say, we will have controlled migration at a pace that we can ensure assimilation.
Well, exactly. This is the part that I think, well, I think most countries gave up on, even if they thought it was right at one point, saying, look, here are our values. We require you to live by these if you want to live in this society.
Yeah,
right?
No one said that. The Swedish government didn't say that. They said, you can import your own values And this is the evil of multiculturalism. We're gonna allow parallel communities. You should make citizenship conditional on assimilation, obviously. You know, if you import significant numbers of people from a culture that thinks women are trash and are just objects for your own satisfaction, then you can't be surprised if things go wrong. It's just not sustainable. And that, again, is not a racist point. That is that is acknowledging the differences in culture, which is completely true. And if it weren't true, by the way, you wouldn't have Iranian feminists risking their lives by taking their veils off and dancing in public. They are not going to be very, and they are not. I've spoken to Iranian women on my show in London, and they are appalled at Western so-called progressives who don't understand that they are on the wrong side here, that they are siding with the most ultra-reactionary, patriarchal, if you will, aspect of Islamic countries. You know, out of what? Some misguided sense that we don't want to be considered racist. How about you stand up for the rights of female Muslims or gay Muslims or Muslims who don't go along with this theocratic nonsense? How about them? Like, why are you siding with the powerful majority there? And how can you square that with being progressive and being anti-racist? Doesn't make any sense to me. You know, the big question of women's rights. You can't just say women's rights are key, except for women in Islamic countries. They don't matter. How can you say that and think you're on the right side of history? That's insane.
Andrew, I've absolutely enjoyed this conversation. Final thought as we finish?
The thing I would like to reiterate and emphasize is that we shouldn't expect authoritarianism to die of natural causes, that it takes eternal vigilance, that it takes continually pushing back against it, and I suppose be very cautious about tribal thinking and assuming that authoritarianism won't emerge on your own side. If I'm going to summarize in a final thought, I would say I want to make the case for liberalism. I want liberalism to be properly understood and properly thought about, and to have those discussions and those debates. Too many people are jettisoning the principles that we'd all kind of collectively agreed on over many, many decades. What I would say is jettison the principles of liberalism at your peril.
Well, Andrew Doyle, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Thank you all for joining Andrew Doyle and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek.